All right, this is talk is about the lender of last resort. A strange sort of term, frequently misused or misunderstood by my reckoning, anyway. It is an extremely important subject, and it's extremely important that there is a lender of last resort in the systems that we have. It's more than that, I would say. It's imperative that there is a lender of last resort. Now, the starting point for this is that the money stock, the money supply, by broad definition, by the way, stop me if I say something that is incomprehensible, because different people maybe have different backgrounds. Stop me and ask me, and I'll try to clarify it or tell you it's coming in a bit or something. So there's a definition of the money stock that is broad. It's important to keep that on an even path, because money is the key determinant of nominal national income. So if the money stock is in any way at threat, then we have a problem. And one principal way that it can be at threat is if we have a financial crisis. Okay, so next step. What is a financial crisis? It's not a big financial institution going bust. That's not a financial crisis. That's bad luck for these people, investors or maybe depositors. It's not, a financial crisis is not the exchange rate collapsing, say. That's a price that will move up and down and will survive the ramifications. It's not someone getting massively into debt and not being able to pay their way out. Bad luck for them again. A financial crisis is better thought of in terms of the definition that a lady economist, Anna Schwartz, gave. And she pinpointed the crux of it. It's a scramble for liquidity, cash, which in a fractional reserve banking system becomes a threat to the payment system. Okay? So something happens that leads to this scramble to get cash. Depositors don't trust their bank anymore, so they go and get their cash out. And they all start to go. And the banks don't carry enough cash in a fractional reserve banking system. And so they get into difficulties. And they may be at risk of going under. Now, if that happens, the payment system doesn't work. That is, ordinary individuals have their salaries paid into their bank and they spend it in the course of the next month. As in again, they spend it. They may save a little bit, put it somewhere else. But the big, great bulk of it is a flow of money into their bank accounts and a flow of money out over the next period. If they can't do that, and indeed the firms who employ them can't do that, then there is a big impact on the real economy. Firms will close, output will fall, etc., downward spiral. It's a disaster. So this threat to the payment system must somehow be solved, and that's where the lender of last resort comes in. But let me go on for a minute or two more on these crises. They're a modern thing, relatively modern, for the simple reason that fractional reserve banking did not develop sufficiently really until the 19th century. It appears at the late 17th in England, and it developed slowly in the 18th, and it's of a size that matters by the beginning of the 19th. Now, what do we mean by this fractional reserve banking and how it develops and so on? Well, banks began really from goldsmiths and people like them, and they began as cloakrooms, in effect. So you take your money along and you put it into the bank. It's like a cloakroom at the theatre. Put your money in, when you want it, you go back and get your coat. You go back and get your money when you want it from the bank. That's fine. Well, after a bit, of course, the bank, the nascent bank, finds it's sitting with all this money that people are not coming back for. Maybe come back in a year's time or two, or they don't use it or something. So the bank thinks, well, I could lend this out and make a profit. Okay, how much to lend out? Half of it? Possibly. That's up to the bank to discover by watching how people draw their money down, how it could lend out, and lend out in a safe way. So it lends out 50% of these deposits, maybe 60, goes on and finds it can go further. And that is, it holds just a fraction of the deposits left with it in relation to its total balance sheet. So if it's just a cloakroom, there's no danger of a financial crisis. People don't like the bank, they go and get their money out and it's sitting there waiting for them. If the bank only holding 50% and everybody wanted to go and get their money, that would be something of a problem, but not total perhaps. But when that fraction reduces, then it becomes an increasing problem. So the bank has, we'll say it gets it down to 10% it holds in cash, and the rest it lends out. But of the rest, it lends a fair bit out to very secure and liquid assets. It's a government, short-term government stock. So if it sees danger signals, then it goes and gets the cash in advance. So it's got the cash in case there's a bit of a run. So if it's got good assets sitting there, highly liquid, then equally, it doesn't have to worry too much. All right then, so this financial crisis, what is it? I've just said. How does it appear? In Irving Fisher, the famous economist, American economist, said displacement takes place. What he meant by that was something new happens. A new market is discovered, say. A new product emerges somehow. Some new process, technological breakthrough. And people pick up on it. This is a great thing. This is going to change the way we do things. And so investment takes place in either producing or developing the market or whatever it is. People begin to get excited, a lot of enthusiasm. They switch out of other things they've invested in to put it into this great new venture that's going on, until a state of euphoria develops. People are borrowing in order to invest. They're borrowing possibly from the banks. The banks are possibly lending more and more than they should do under normal principles of caution. And then at some point, insiders see that this thing has possibly reached a limit for them, and they start to leave. They take their profits at that point and go. And others might notice this and they go too. And some talk goes on, and fear starts to spread that actually this thing has hit its limits. And then there's a rush to get out, and then there's a panic and a collapse. And in that process, the banks are critical to this. They entered into this somewhere along that line and began to lend, possibly, many of them obviously, likely, excessively. So they turn, what can they do? Well, they can't do anything in the absence of some source of cash. What is the source of cash, the ultimate source of cash? Who holds the ultimate source of cash? Well, it's the central bank. Of course, it wasn't there in the very early days, and it's part of the explanation for why it appears that institution is the only one that can provide the cash. It's responsible for the cash. It decides how much cash there will be. And so long as these banks have got decent assets, they can trot along to the central bank, hand over their decent, acceptable assets, and get cash in return. Okay? So we got this fractional reserve banking system, which is subject to pressure if there's a shock to the system, a financial crisis. The financial crisis strikes. Some banks find themselves pushed to the limit. They'll have to close if they can't get liquidity. And so the solution to that is for there to be a lender of last resort. There's no other place you can go. It is the last resort. And so the banks go along with their acceptable assets. It should be clear what these are in advance. And they take them to the bank and they get cash in return, and everything is then hunky-dory, as we used to say. Everything is fine. No problem. Well, some refinements now and some caveats. The practice of the lender of last resort evolved very slowly in England in the course of the 19th century. In 1825, the first great financial crisis of capitalism blew up in England. And it came about because we heard news that there was a world out there with enormous prospects. It was Latin America. Things were going on there, and they had precious metals, and they were getting freedom from their Spanish imperialist masters. They were getting independence. This was terrific. Great investment. Money poured in. Everybody wanted to be in on this exciting project. The Bank of England lent very freely, reduced interest rates. Country banks lent, got more notes, and there was a great boom developed. And a boom developed in England at the same time related to that. So there was great investment in infrastructure, canals, and the very beginnings of the railways and ports, and so on. A fabulous boom. And then the pattern began to emerge. There were those who weren't convinced that this could continue, and it began to get out. The Bank of England began to worry that it might not get its money back, so it hiked up interest rates. So immediately there's a squeeze in the markets, and the stock market turned down, and we get all the usual things that we have come to expect, and there's a banking panic and a run on the banks. Now in England at that time, there were about 400 banks, maybe 600. It's hard to get the right figure. So a lot of banks, and a lot of them under great pressure. And what can be done? People are going directly to the Bank of England with gold or bank notes and saying, just give us cash. The bank didn't know how to behave. It lent a bit more. The pressure was building, banks are failing, the real economy is being affected. But bit by bit, they accepted that there's nowhere else people go, and so we have to pay out as much as we can. They did that, and some of the stories that they presented tell us that they lent on pretty well anything that people came up with. You know, so desperate was the situation that they would dole out cash on the strength of pretty weak assets. And such was the panic that they didn't count the cash, they just weighed it on the machine because they had to push it out at such a rate. It was a phenomenal event. Now, there are certain things at work here too that prevents them from behaving as they would learn in the end to behave. We were on the gold standard. And being on the gold standard means the number of notes you have printed relates to how much gold you have. You can't break these limits. At the time, it was loosely defined, so you could have a proportion of gold as the base for your note issue, a little bit of flexibility, but not much. More than that, there were usury laws in force. Usury laws dated from very early times, charging people interest. This is partly a religious origin. Charging people interest was thought to be a bad thing. Certainly high interest was a very bad thing. It seemed to these early scholars that you were getting something that you weren't entitled to by charging people in distress very high interest rates. So these usury laws were in place which capped the level of interest that could be charged in the economy. Of course, as you would readily see, there are many ways around that sort of thing, but the Bank of England couldn't go around them. Bank of England is a major institution, it's the government's bank. It can't break that sort of law. So the usury laws are in place, which means it's got to fork out cash at a capped rate of 5% as it was then. That's not ideal when you want to kind of ration the stuff out by price. So the usury laws were relaxed. Don't have water, do we, Wen? It's okay, I can survive. The usury laws are relaxed. But the gold standard is still a restriction. Anyway, we go through the same thing in the 1830s. There's another crisis. Not quite as bad, but there's another crisis. In the 1840s, 1847, same again, similar thing. This time it was the railways have taken off in a big way. Everybody wants to own railway stock. Railways are being built all over the country. All kind of companies are entering it. Investment is huge. On and on we go again, and we get a crisis of the same kind. 1857, another crisis. This time it comes from the American West. The American West is being developed, opened up, and there's another great story. We've forgotten about Latin America of the 1820s. This is another wonderful prospect in the Americas. Thank you, Juan. And same sort of thing, investment, borrowing to on we go, boom, tightening, collapse, crisis. Then in 1866, there was another of these. This time it's different. It's a huge institution in London, the biggest financial institution in the world as it happened, called Overend Gurney and Company. And they were a discount house, more than a bank, but they did banking business. And it's interesting to look at the story there too. What happened, a lot of young people came in, they saw these old fuddy-duddies who could be making bigger profits, you know, why don't we lend on this and lend on this and so on, which they did, and got into difficulties, severe difficulties. They were across the road from the Bank of England, literally. They went to the Bank of England seeking help. The bank said, no, don't like your assets, go away. Overend Gurney fails, biggest financial institution in the world, fails. Of course, a lot of other banks get into a panic, and people panic, and there is a crisis. And the bank, at this point, this is through several crises, it finally gets the message that only it can solve this problem, and it starts to lend. Quite late in the day, but it lends, and the crisis goes away. And it's at that point, really, that the Bank of England accepts that its job is to behave in this fashion. A couple of more things, of course, to add to this. It shouldn't be a competitor in the banking system. It was at the time. It was a big bank. It had the privilege of being the government's bank, a lot of business there, but it did a lot of other commercial business. But you can't do that as the lender of last resort. You're competing with the very people that you're supposed to be ready to assist. And the other thing is that it's ideal if it pre-commits to behaving in this way. So it says in advance, look, when there's a scramble for liquidity, do not worry, you come to us with these acceptable assets and there'll be no need to panic. And one further thing makes this lender the ideal kind, and that is it should do this lending anonymously. So the way I like to describe it is it has a discount window and it's made of frosted glass, and it only goes up about 6 inches. So the person who's got assets comes along and pushes them under the frosted glass. The person on the other side looks at them. These are the kinds of assets we discount. Here's the cash. We don't know who's on the other side of the window. We don't care. All we do is discount good assets. So if you're a bank with kind of dodgy assets, you trot along to the bank and you present your bills and they push them back. These are not acceptable. No. Then bad luck. If you have got poor assets, then you go to the wall. If you've got good assets, you can always get cash. So from that point on, we get the banking system learning how to be sufficiently cautious to have the appropriate balance sheet, the right kind of assets. We have the Bank of England understanding that it should provide liquid assets, cash, when there's a demand for it. And if it tells the market in advance that it will do that, then the system should be running smoothly. Banks will still fail because there'll still be banks who take great risk. That's part of the system. That's healthy. We want that to happen. Well-behaved banks will not be at threat from the liquidity squeeze because they will always be able to get the cash from the final source. So following 1866, we had in England roughly 100 years when there was no financial crisis. So when you hear people today saying when the next financial crisis comes, as it will, and people saying well, it'll be 2025, you can see the signs and so on. So hang on a minute. We had a period of more than a century when there were no financial crises. Now, if you know some monetary history, you might say, oh, well, hang on a minute, there are 1 or 2 episodes in there you should tell us about. Like in 1890, wasn't there the Bearing crisis? Yes, there was. A big institution was going under, but it wasn't a financial crisis. There was no ripple in the rest of the market. Bearings had lent unwisely in Argentina and were going to go bust. The Bank of England is very close. There are a lot of personnel who, by marriage and so on, directors of Bearings in the bank. And they felt they should do something to save Bearings and the reputation of the City of London. Well, okay, that's fine. That's an activity you can get on with. You can call it what you like, crisis management or something like that, but it's not a financial crisis. In 1931, you'll quite often hear it said, indeed, there are articles written, the financial crisis of 1931, but there was no financial crisis in 1931. There was an exchange rate crisis. The pound sterling was under great pressure. It was finally taken off the gold standard and fell sharply. But it wasn't a financial crisis. The banks are completely sound. In fact, their profitability is not affected right through the period. What about 1914, though? Well, yes, there was a crisis in 1914 when war broke out and we couldn't get remittances due to us into the system, due from continental Europe. So the banks have got a serious problem. But that's very unusual circumstances. There was no, boom, there's no easy money, there's no wild spending and borrowing and so on. So we can leave 1914 out of it. So we go through over 100 years before we get another crisis, and that came in 1974. It was a smallish affair. It was called the shadow banking crisis. We can talk about all of these things at greater length if you want. I won't go further on that for the moment. Let me just make two final comments to give us some time for some questions and discussion. In the 1930s, particularly in the United States, there was the Great Depression. This is the biggest disaster, economic disaster, to hit the United States in its entire history. This is shattering. A financial crisis on a colossal scale, a collapse in output, unemployment of 25 to 30%. Of the 13,000-ish banks in the US, 7,000 failed. It is a horrific event. Unemployment on that scale is a disaster. Output falling on a similar kind of scale. What was the problem? Well, the problem was the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was born in 1914. So it's a youngish institution. Nevertheless, it had had enough experience, particularly 2021, there was a crisis. It had enough experience, and of course it could learn from the Bank of England's long experience, to know what it should be doing. And it made some sorts of attempts. If you look at the cash that the Fed injected, it is quite substantial, but nowhere near enough to get back to keeping that broad money definition of the money stock on track. So the Federal Reserve was guilty. We jump forward to, let's just jump forward to 1987 when there was a big stock market crash. At that point, everyone predicted that there's a recession coming. The recession will be here in a matter of months. The Federal Reserve immediately pumped cash into the system. And lo and behold, there was no recession. Unfortunately, at every blink after that along the way, the Fed pumped a bit of cash into the system. And the Americans began to accept that we're not going to have a recession. The Fed is there to see that we don't. But that encouraged poor behavior, and ultimately it blew up in the 2007-8 crisis. That was the biggest crisis of all time. That was bigger, insofar as we can measure these things, than 1825 or 1866. This was colossal. So the danger clearly is of a huge recession, Great Depression again, but this time the banks should know, the central banks, how to behave. And indeed, Bernanke in the United States did a PhD thesis at MIT on the Great Depression and the Federal Reserve. And in 2002, I think it was, he was giving a talk where Milton Friedman was in the audience, and Milton Friedman had been the leading figure who pointed the finger at the Federal Reserve and said they caused the Great Depression. Bernanke addressed Friedman and he said, I know, we did it and it won't happen again. So Bernanke, as then now chairman of the Federal Reserve in the latest crisis, should be ready to act in the appropriate way. And indeed, that's pretty much what he tried to do. But there's a very good book just come out by Bernanke, Geithner, and Paulson. So Bernanke's chairman of the Federal Reserve, Geithner is chairman of the New York Fed, Paulson is secretary to the Treasury. And the three of them have written this book together, explaining step by step what happened in the US in the Great crisis. And it's an interesting read. They say they knew what to do, but frequently they were obstructed either by the law, that you weren't allowed to do this kind of thing or something. But it is worth a read. They knew what to do, they tried to do it, they more or less did it, and we were saved from a Great Depression. And we did something similar in this country. Mervyn King was the governor. He had a very keen feel for history. He may have overstepped his response in a way and prevented the solution developing as quickly as he might. But when they got over that, then the show was on the road. We had this quantitative easing, which is pumping liquidity into the system to try to keep the money stock on its path. So, at a bit of a gallop, that's what I believe the lender of last resort is, how it developed, what it should do, and how it can save us from a Great Depression.
Thank you very much, Forrest. Thank you.